Whenever you meet somebody new, or whenever there's a new visitor that comes into church, hopefully you go on and you speak to them. But there's always a certain few types of questions that you'll always ask a new person or a new visitor. Questions like, what are you doing in my chair? Don't you know that's where I always sit? Hopefully that's not your response. I have been in a few churches where I have heard that asked. But what are those types of questions that you would ask somebody that you've met for the first time? Well, asking them their name is a really good start, isn't it? What's your name? What's your job? Where have you come from? Those sorts of questions we get all the time. And what we're really trying to do when you meet somebody for the first time and you're trying to get to know them, you're really trying to work out something very important. You're trying to find out, what is their identity? Who is this person? When we come to Jonah chapter 1 and verses 7 to 10 that we're going to be looking at tonight, what we really see is the question of identity. The sailors are in deep panic as the oceans and waves are raging and roaring, and they ask of several people, who are you? Who are you? Why are you here? What are you doing? What is your purpose? And so as we come to these verses, we're going to be thinking about the concept of identity. And it's not just something we're going to think about from a historic perspective, which obviously Jonah is. We're also going to be asking it of ourselves. Who are you this evening? Who do you think that you are? And who are you really? What is your identity? Where is your true value and worth and meaning found? So, my first point is, as we begin, we are in the middle of this great storm. And my first point is the identity of the storm. The sailors have tried everything they can to try and steer the ship. The sailors have done everything they can to try and keep this boat afloat. But the waves have come, the winds have come because God has sent them, and the boat threatened to break up. This is a crisis point for the sailors. Now, in these few verses, we almost see that the sailors give up on a human solution. They've thrown the cargo overboard. They've tried to sail and navigate it. None of that worked. They've given up on a human solution, and now they are looking for a spiritual cause. Here the sailors identify the cause of the storm. The sailors, just like the people in Wales, were used to storms. We're used to storms in Wales. They were very used to storms being on the sea for most of their lives. But there is something unique about this storm. They'd lived through great winds. They'd lived through great rain. But there is something about this storm in which they identify that this is a storm sent from a God. And they almost identify in verse 7 that this storm is coming upon them because of someone's disobedience. And they want to know whose fault it is. We all want to know that, don't we? Whenever something goes wrong, the first thing we want to know is, who can I blame? And that's what the pagan sailors do. Verse 7, they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. There's a really interesting description that the sailors use of the storm, and they use the description in the ESV, it's of evil. Let us find out on whose account this evil has come upon us. The sailors are in this great storm and they are terrified. I read through a number of Bible translations, and these are some of the different words that different Bible translations used to describe what the sailors described the storm as. Calamity, trouble, disaster, danger, catastrophe, and as the ESV and the AV say, evil. And what I find particularly interesting about this is that these pagan sailors, they're identifying this storm as being an absolute nightmare. It is danger, it is death, it is ruin, it is destruction. However, we know that God sent this storm. And I find it really interesting that the sailors have identified this storm with really quite strong negative words. But this storm is actually sent from God. Can God send something that is catastrophe, that is calamity, that is evil? I think it poses a really interesting question. But I want to give you a spoiler alert for the book of Jonah. So if you don't want to find out how the book of Jonah ends, cover your ears now. Because we know that God is at work in the middle of this storm. That God is using it for good. And I've identified 5 groups of people that God brings about this storm for good for. The first one is it's good for Jonah. The storm is good for Jonah because it brings him to a place where in his disobedience he turns back and goes where God wants him to be. The storm is good for the sailors because they are physically delivered from the storm, but they're also spiritually saved. And we'll come to that later. I believe it's a genuine conversion of the sailors. The third thing, I think the storm is really good for creation. The wind and the waves and the big fish were able to serve the Creator and bring glory to the one who made them. It's also good for Nineveh because of this storm that leads to them throwing Jonah into the water, there is conversion and revival in Nineveh. And many people are saved because of what God began when he sent that storm after the fleeing prophet. And then finally, this storm is good for us because we have in this book truths about the Bible, truths about God, truths about ourselves that should warm our hearts. The storm that God sent, he was using and working for brilliant good, for his glory, for his name's sake, for the salvation of many people. And what I find incredibly interesting is the sailors in the middle of the storm couldn't think of any good that could possibly come out of this. It was calamity. It was disaster. In the midst of the storms that they were going through, how could anything good come out of this? Well, friends, thousands of years later, I think this principle is incredibly true for us, isn't it? As you struggle through many difficult things in your life, sometimes it can be impossible to comprehend how is God going to use this disaster to glorify his name. How is this experience I'm going through, how can it ever lead to God's glory? How can it ever lead to his name being lifted up? We ask ourselves this question all the time, don't we? Lord, why have you allowed this to happen? Or if we're being very honest one day, we don't care about other people. We often ask, but why me? Why have you allowed it to happen to me? You see, in identifying the storms, the sailor have identified that it is from a God, and they later find out it's from the one true God. But they have failed to identify that the God who sent the storm is using the storm to achieve their good, to achieve glory to his name. And Christians, so often we do exactly the same thing. You might be grieving a loved one. You might be scared of getting test results back. You might be stressed by family life. You might be overwhelmed by your work life and your work situation. And in the great storms of life, you have forgotten God is at work. Even in the chaos, even in the hardship, God is sovereign and God is at work through the storms. We look at the church today, how easy it is to forget God is at work. Jesus Christ is still on the throne. He is still working his plans and purposes. And so often we see churches getting smaller and smaller. We see church doors closing forever. And maybe there's part of you that cries out as you look at the darkness in the world. You cry out, Lord, how can you possibly be at work? Maybe we should take a step closer to home. What about Libanus Church? As we think about us as a church, well, we're getting older and older. Many of the members are getting frailer and frailer. Weaker by weaker, slower by slower each week. We are struggling to do all of the things that we used to do. And maybe you're wondering, where's the church going to be in 30 years, in 10 years? It can be very easy to look at many churches across Swansea and think they are in distress. They are heading for catastrophe. But friends, I want to remind you what the sailors did not know yet. Jesus is alive. Jesus is working. He is reigning and ruling today. This very day, Christ is alive. Today, Jesus is at work. Today, Jesus is working everything to his plans and purpose. Our God holds the past, the present, and the future in his hand. He is the Almighty. All authority has been given to him. And so often the danger is, when we're in the midst of this storm, we forget that the storm is not evidence that God is absent, but it is a sign that God is active and present and at work. So often in our lives, it is the hardest times, it is the darkest times when we see God working most, isn't it? Friends, we all need that great reminder. Jesus is at work. The theme of my whole series on Jonah is looking at the greater Jonah. Jesus calmed the storm when he was on earth. And it's interesting that he calmed the storm from in the midst of the storm. And so often God works most profoundly and powerfully in your time of need and in your time of crisis. Isn't that often when we feel closest to God? When everything around us has crumbled and all we can cling to is Jesus. Even in the storm, God is at work. Never forget that. Whatever you're going through, whatever you're struggling through, he lives. He's alive. And he is working his plans and purposes for the glory of his name. But I just got one final thing that I want to identify just on the storm. It comes to a point where the sailors throw Jonah into the water. I wonder, did the sailors ever know that Jonah lived? I think it's a really interesting question. Did the sailors ever find out that this God didn't just spare them, but this God who calmed the storm also offered forgiveness and rescue and salvation to the one who was fleeing him? Did the sailors know that actually this prophet then went on to Nineveh and so many people were saved in that great evil city? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us. We don't know. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But it's a reminder, isn't it? And it's a tough reality, but sometimes you will not find out why God allowed you to go through that particular storm or difficulty. We don't know if the sailors ever found out the fullness of why God had allowed it. Sometimes in this life you might get glimpses of why God has allowed and ordained certain things. And sometimes we will not find out this side of glory. Some of us will go to our graves wondering, Lord, how was that ever for your good? How will that ever be used to lift up the name of Christ? But the question is not, will we find out in this life? The question is, do you believe that in all things our God is at work? I can't put it better than this great hymn. I know not what of good or ill may be reserved for me. That's a scary line to sing, isn't it? I don't know if there's good things happening. I don't know if there's a raging storm in the next few days coming my way. Or of weary ways or golden days before his face I see. But I know whom I have believed, and am persuaded that he is able. Whatever you are going through, whatever storm is raging in your life, does not alter the fact Christ is alive. He's working today. In your lives, God is at work. My second point is the identity of the stranger. Jonah is aboard this boat, and really nobody has a clue who he is. Nobody knows who Jonah is. And so, verse 8, they begin questioning him. They said to him, "Tell us, on whose account this evil has come upon us? What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? And what are your people?" So the lot has been cast, it's fallen on Jonah, and so they've gone to him and said, "Why is this storm happening? What have you done?" And notice in verse 8, they ask some of those key questions. They're trying to find out the identity of this stranger. Really what they're asking Jonah, as Tim Keller puts it, they're asking for his purpose, his place, and his people. That's a great way of saying his identity. They're grabbing Jonah in the midst of the storm and saying, "Who are you? Why is this happening because of you?" They want to know the core, the essence of this man, Jonah. In the ancient world, gods were often localized. And so if you were from this particular place, you would tend to worship that particular god. And so by asking him where he's from, they don't really care about who his family is or who he's related to. They're really asking, what God is angry with you? What God who controls the storms and the seas is angry with you? Another way to put it is they wanted to know to whom did he worship? Who did Jonah worship? It's a very profound thing to think about, but your identity, who you are at the very core, is in who you worship. What and who you worship is your identity. It's the thing you're longing for. It's the thing you're reaching for. It's the thing you're looking for salvation in. And this, please don't think this is all about ancient gods that nobody believes in anymore. Friends, this is modern and relevant and up to date. For how many people in in the streets of Morriston worship celebrities, fame, money, wealth, holidays, themselves. Maybe just a quiet life is what they're pinning all their hopes and dreams on. But where someone worships, or what someone worships, there you will find their identity. What somebody and who somebody really is that thing that is their greatest and deepest longing. Christian idolatry is very real and very relevant today. We might not worship idols, but we worship ourselves, don't we? How often do we take good things of God and use them as idolatry? How often do we take good things? Family, gardening. How often do we take good and beautiful things and use them to divert our love, which should be for God and God alone, and slowly our other priorities, they take the first place? There's a very real danger here. What are you worshipping? Pastor John looked at that this morning. Who or what are you worshipping? Well, this is Jonah's response in verse 9. This is Jonah's identity. He says to them, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Now, hands up, who thinks that is a good response from Jonah in verse 9? I'm going to take a little straw poll. Hands up who thinks verse 9 is a good response from Jonah. Hands up who thinks verse 9 is a bad response from Jonah. And hands up if you didn't put your hand up in case you got it wrong. There you go, a few honest people. It's a really interesting response from Jonah. This response, and you'll have to bear with me with this one, this response reminds me of Morecambe and Wise. Because when you look at this response, it's just like that sketch with it when he's playing the piano and he says those infamous lines, you're playing all the wrong notes. And he says, I'm playing all the right notes, just not necessarily in the right order. Isn't that what Jonah is doing here? It's a really interesting response, not because of just the words he uses, but the order and the priority in which he puts them in. The first thing I find quite funny, I'll say it as an aside, what is the first question that they ask him? The first thing they ask him is, what's your occupation? He ignores that one entirely. He is a prophet of the Lord running away from the Lord. He's going to keep that one a secret, isn't he? So he ignores that question. But in his response, the first thing he declares is, I am a Hebrew. I wonder why that was first. Might it be that his nation and his heritage was more important to him than his mission and his God? What is your identity? What makes up who you are? Your likes, your dislikes, your habits. Now for me, drinking tea, playing chess, and wearing cardigans is a big part of who I am. That is a large part of my identity. But it's not the most important thing. None of those things will ever surpass what should be the first in all of our lives. I am saved. I belong to the Savior. I believe in Jesus Christ and Jesus Christ alone. For those of you who are married, it's important. It's a massive part of your life. But it's not the most important thing. For those of you who are working and high-flying, well, it's important. But work isn't the most important thing in your life. For those of you that are retired, relaxing and looking after yourself is an important part of your lives. But it's never to be the most important thing. If somebody was to ask you to name the top 10 things about yourself, I wonder how many of us would get to number 8 and forget to say I'm one of Jesus' people. I'm saved. I'm adopted. It should be the very first thing on our lips. Being Welsh is truly a gift from God, but it's not the fullness of our identity, is it? So what is our identity? Galatians 2 and verse 20. Paul says, "For I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith in the Son of God." If you know Jesus Christ this evening, it changes everything. Elsewhere, Scripture says that for we are a new creation in him. 1 Peter 2:9, what is your identity, Christian? "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people of his own possession, that you might proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into marvelous light." Friends, what's the most important thing to you? If it is not Jesus Christ, then your identity is wrong. For your identity is in what you are worshipping. We must all, whether you're a Christian here this evening, whether you're not, we must all think about our priorities. Is Jesus the first in our life? My final point is the identity of the sovereign. I just want to answer one simple question here, and that is, who is God? Who is God to define me? Why should my identity be rooted in God? Well, the first thing is that he is the God who commands the storm. We've already looked at this, so I'm not going to look at it in much detail. But I want to remind you that if you think a storm that is going to sink a sailing vessel is powerful, you have forgotten the God who commands the storms that can break up boats. Our God is mighty and powerful, and he is in control of this situation. Our God is the sovereign Lord of the storm. The other thing we read in these verses is that they cast lots. The sailors cast lots, and the lot landed on Jonah. That was lucky, wasn't it? That was a spot of luck the sailors had. It's funny that, isn't it? Of all the people on the boat, it just happened to land on Jonah. What are the chances of that? Well, Proverbs 16 and verse 33 has the answer. The lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. The lots that they cast, even that, God was sovereign over. I love this. I think the casting of the lots is one of my favorite bits in the story of Jonah. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Sam, wait till you get to the big fish. But hear me out. I want to make the case that the casting of the lots is truly fascinating. Because God being sovereign over the storm, that makes sense to us. God being sovereign over the depth of creation, that sort of makes sense to us. But God being sovereign over something so small in the midst of something so big, that blows me away. Because it reminds me that in your lives, Jesus is not just working things, the big things for his glory. Jesus is working the boring, mundane, average things in your life. Is he not in those as well? It's not just in the big, fierce storm that God is working, but it's in the small casting of lots. God is sovereign of that as well. In the big things of your life, Jesus is at work. In the little things, in the things that you might not even notice or realize, Jesus is using them for his name's sake. Isn't that wonderful? In the big things, Jesus is sovereign. In the small things, Jesus is sovereign. From the largest event in human history or the smallest, most mundane, irrelevant decision, we affirm Christ is Lord over all. All of it is relevant. All of it can be used to the glory of God. You think, well, what is my life to God? I haven't done this, I haven't done that, I haven't been a great missionary, I haven't seen thousands of people converted like in Nineveh. Jesus Christ is working in your lives as Christians in the small things as well as the big things to bring glory to his name. Even in the casting of lots, God was sovereign. God was in charge. God was there. I want us to end just by considering that there is one who is greater than Jonah. Jesus Christ himself is the greater Jonah. And the lots fell upon Jonah because Jonah was a prophet unfaithfully fleeing from God. But as for our greater Jonah, the lots were cast for his clothing as he was stripped and beaten and nailed to a cross. And you know what's amazing about that? He's the sovereign. He's the one who reigns. He's the one who rules. He wasn't defeated upon the cross, but he allowed himself to be crucified because his love for his people was so great. Jonah is the prophet who fled from the will of God, and Jesus Christ is the greater Jonah, the greater prophet, the final prophet who followed and obeyed his Father perfectly, even unto death upon a cross. How does Jonah describe the God he worships? I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Who is Jesus Christ? But the God who walked on the dry land, the God who sailed upon the sea and occasionally walked on it as well. He is God who has come down, walked on this earth, walked on the water, and now where is he? He's the God of heaven. He has risen and ascended in triumph and victory, and there Jesus Christ stands. He's sitting on the very throne room of God, the King of the universe, sovereign and ruling over everything. What is your identity? What are you worshipping? Is your identity in this greater Jonah, in this Jesus? Is he the first in your life? Do you trust him to be with you in every circumstance? Do you believe Jesus is at work in your life? Big things, small things, he's at work. Christ is alive. Christ is at work. Friends, trust him. Make him the first in your life. Amen.